Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. This is part 2 of my ANUBIS illustration in the steampunk style. So in this part of the video, in this portion, I'm actually working on the background. So at first I did think about doing a very cubic type background design for the column. And as you can see, I'm figuring out the basic planes, the basic perspective for this character in this environment. But I didn't like the way it was looking because I'd done already several pieces that were very cubic, and I was looking at some of the Egyptian architecture and they didn't have columns like that. So for this reason, I started adding the arches and changing some of the layout for that background, just because I didn't like the way it was originally going. Now, as in previous videos, I am blocking out the general shape before I actually start adding any details. The reason why I do this is it lets me see the overall silhouette of the background and see if it works, and to make changes quickly without wasting too much time. The background only took about 2 hours tops. It was actually really short to draw the background in, just because most of the detail did go into the character itself, and because I was using some textures, very limited amounts of texture, it still helped reduce the overall painting time for the background. Also, the background is further in the background, and because it is further away from the viewer, it also means I don't have to add as much detail to the background. It still has to be accurate, still has to read properly, but it means that I can simplify some of the shapes a little bit more without adding too much detail. So as you can see, I'm trying out a couple different designs for the column. I was looking at a little bit of reference, not too much. I did want to make this my own, because it is in the steampunk style, so there's really not too many rules once you're into that style for the background. So this is where I'm actually adding more of an Egyptian feel to the columns. I'm solidifying that column to make sure that it's structured properly once I get the initial idea for it and the initial basic structure for it. So I'm just solidifying the edges to make sure that they line up a little bit more without lining up completely, because I don't want it to look too rigid. Just has to make sense as an overall design. Once again, I work in grayscale. It's a lot simpler to do changes later on if I'm just working in grayscale, because I can add the color on a separate layer, and it's just faster for me. Now, the arches, unlike previous designs, these are more of a stone type archway. So for this reason, I'm once again blocking in the general shapes for the archway, and since I have them, both of them fairly similar on either side of the column, later what you'll see me do is I'm actually just going to duplicate that, just because it's a lot faster. So I'm making sure that the perspective reads correctly on the stones themselves, because you would see a tiny bit of the edge on the left side of those stones and on the bottom, just because of the perspective that's there. Solidifying some of the shapes so that they're a little bit more rectangular, but not being too much. Now I did find that those edges didn't show up enough, so all I did is darken that one side a little bit more so it shows up properly. Now this whole background was done pretty much on one layer. Right after Well, until this point where I'm actually duplicating the other side. But once I duplicated the other side, I just flattened both of those onto the same layer. There was no reason for them to remain separate layers. It's just easier to paint if they're the same layer. So for this reason, I just amalgamated the two. Okay, and I'm just adding a texture in there once I'm lining it up properly. So once the texture is lined up properly, this adds a little bit more detail to the overall background design, and also gives me a color palette to add onto the background as well. So I'm sampling some of the colors on the bottom layer and adding those into the back of the character. This just makes it really easy to add a color palette. Once again, I have a very limited color palette when I'm working on these, just so that I'm not too distracted with color immediately. And I do like to use reference material normally to get small amounts of samples of the colors as well. Now, although he is technically the god of the underworld, I did light him in a very light shading. So because he's not too dark shading wise, I did have to lighten up the overall scene. And because I didn't want to draw him on the surface of Earth, I wanted it to be more of an illumination underground. It's kind of misty. You don't know what's behind him past these archways. It's kind of an unknown place. So maybe he's visiting a different god. Maybe he's in somebody else's palace. You don't know. And for this reason, I wanted to add a little bit more mystery to the overall background design, just by adding a tiny bit of mist. Now, although I did use a texture for the cobblestones, because I'm using a texture, I can't just use the texture itself. The main problem is, first of all, the resolution is normally very low. Second of all, it looks too inorganic if you don't add a little bit more detail within those areas. So for this reason, I'm just solidifying some of the cracks, sampling the colors that are within that texture itself, making sure it fits with the rest of the image. That is important. It has to fit. If it doesn't fit, there's no point in putting the texture in. It's just not going to work as a design. So once again, I'm just doing some modifications to that column to make sure that it fits in with the bottom of the piece as well. I'm adding back in the energy that's coming out of him. Now, when I was initially working on that sword, the original sword design, which I later turned into an energy form, I worked on it in white initially because I had a black background, so it's just easier for me to see. That's why you see me alternating between white and black. All I did is I inversed the colors, and by doing that, I could see it on either a dark color or a light color, and it also allowed me to change the overall colors very easily. Now, although he's in a very light background, there would still be a small amount of cast shadow. For this reason, I'm just adding this into a separate layer beneath the character to make sure that it reads properly. And I'm just touching up some of the shadows that would be more visible in certain areas on the character. Because now that I have the background and I actually know what the actual lighting for the scene is, I could finally finalize some of these areas of shadow. I didn't want the shadows to be too dark, so I did actually use very little additional shadows onto the character. Most of the shadows were already there and were accurate enough that I didn't have to do too many changes. The main changes occurred on his body armor, in which I simplified a lot of the shadows so that I could later modify them. There's also some areas that of the character that just didn't show up enough, so for this reason I just added a tiny bit more shadow in certain areas to emphasize the structure and the shape. Some of those shadows might not be actually accurate, but they do once again help emphasize some of the shape and structure of the character, which is also important. This is the finalized image. This was a really fun drawing, actually. I really enjoyed drawing steampunk, so I might actually do some future projects where I'm incorporating some normal traditional pieces or ideas with this style, just because I do really enjoy the industrial style. So I hope you liked the second portion of my ANUBIS Steampunk illustration, and I hope you guys tune in for next time. Thank you and take care.